Okay, well, as you may or may not know, I am stepping in for Dr. Wertzer today, and the big, broad topic for the day is government intervention in real estate markets. And so what we're going to do is go through a pretty wide assortment of topics to kind of get you familiarized with specifically some of the different ways, predominantly, that the local governments get involved in regulating or controlling or incentivizing or de-incentivizing the development of real estate, okay? This particular topic is probably one of my personal favorites because this is kind of how I actually got my initial interest in real estate. Whenever I was probably in high school, one of the first things I did after getting my driver's license was to get a speeding ticket. And I got that speeding ticket, and then I had to go to the local municipal court in the small little town of about 10,000 people that I lived in, walk in there and plead my case before the local judge for the speeding ticket. But while I was in there, it was actually held in the local council chambers. And I was like, well, this kind of looks interesting. You know, what do these guys do? And so shortly after that, I decided, well, every Tuesday and Thursday night from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and I'm going to start attending council meetings because I want to know kind of what this is all about and what they're actually doing. Well, virtually every single session pretty much centered around some aspect of how they were getting involved as a local government in real estate matters. And so for me, it took on a very sort of interesting kind of dynamic of kind of trying to understand, well, why is it the government should get involved or should not get involved, or how do they get involved in controlling what actually happens within a community? Well, this whole course, the land use planning and project design course, should be, for the most part, focused on that particular aspect, okay? And really sort of saying, well, what are the different ways that government can kind of get involved in local land use, and what are the kinds of things that they might go about trying to influence or control? And why, as a developer, do we even care about this? Well, the big reason is money, okay? Because at the end of the day, any sort of regulation that a local government tends to sort of push out there, or any sort of control mechanism or device that they deploy, for the most part, it's all about some sort of revenue generation or revenue extraction for the part of the developer, okay? In some cases, what they're doing is they're trying to incentivize maybe a certain type of development to come to town. In other instances, they're putting up the roadblocks and saying, we don't want this type of development to come to town for this reason or another, okay? And so part of what we're going to talk about today is just sort of how some of these different things work, how they affect the developer in terms of the bottom line on their projects, because pretty much it's going to affect the actual cost of the development and or impact the operating cash flows of that development for however many years it may be in operation, okay? Does that make sense? So that's the big broad picture of kind of what this is all about and why you should really care, is that ultimately all of this has to do with what is the government's role, what should maybe the government's role be, do we necessarily agree with everything that they're potentially doing, and how might it even be different from one jurisdiction to another with respect to some of these things, okay? So what I'm going to do, one of the first topics we can kind of start out with, and obviously it looks like all of you or most of you are familiar with what eminent domain is. So given that you are familiar with it, you tell me, what is eminent domain?
When the government basically takes someone's property or home for public use.
Okay, is it just inherently just for public, or how might we define public use?
Well, I mean to benefit the community, not just to give to a developer or something.
Okay, to benefit the community. But once again, could that be giving that property to a developer?
It shouldn't be, but it can.
Okay. So where did this whole idea come from? This whole idea of eminent domain?
It probably came from the fact that some homeowner didn't want to give up his property and it was detrimental to the community, so the government needed a vehicle from which to seize the land to, right?
Okay. In essence, it's what you're really trying to sort of say with this concept is it is the government's right to sort of step in for the public good and potentially to acquire the property rights of someone that may be a private property owner, to reposition that property possibly for some sort of public use or some sort of use that might benefit the public in some way in the name of maybe economic development, okay? And so, you know, my suspicion is, those of you that are familiar with this, you've probably been in some of those sort of discussions of, okay, that you've got, let's say, somebody who owns, and we'll take a commercial property in maybe a downtown area, and this, you know, person maybe owns an entire city block, you know, so we've got, you know, this big parcel of land, and we've got maybe an existing building on this parcel, and the building has been in disrepair, hasn't been in use in several years, and, you know, is really not contributing anything of significance to the local property tax rolls. So all of a sudden the local government says, hey, we want to take this entire city block and we want to redevelop it, okay? Well, initially, maybe they even approach the owner of this parcel and say, hey, you've owned this parcel for, you know, many years, you haven't done anything productive with it, and we would like to do something productive with it, please sell it to us. And what happens? The owner says, no, I don't want to sell. I'm perfectly happy and content owning this property in its derelict state, not generating any income off of it, and paying what little property taxes that I have to pay for whatever reasons that they might have. Well, the local government comes back and says, well, sorry, that's not good enough for us. We have big plans for this area. We want to take your property, we want to purchase it, we want to tear it down, and we want to build something spectacular there, okay? Maybe a new football stadium, maybe a new school, maybe, you know, some other sort of use. So what do you think about the government being able to do that in that sort of scenario as I've described it?
In that scenario, I think it makes sense because he's not doing anything productive with the property. The city is probably losing money because they're not gaining anything from the property. So what's really the harm? I mean, do they always get paid?
They will get paid, and they will get paid based upon market value.
Which
And in a lot of instances, they will even be offered by most of the local governments, before they go down the eminent domain route, they will actually be offered more than market value, just so that the local government or whoever can avoid having to go through the eminent domain proceedings. Just a threat alone of eminent domain, coupled with giving the individual, the owner.
So the owner's not taking a loss from it.
Well, at least in that sense.
In that sense, yes.
He may take a loss from it, I mean.
You know, what if they bought it
Loss.
what if they bought it for $10 million and the property has deteriorated to such a state that's only worth $1 million?
Or now, they probably could have sold it for $2 million, but now that you know it's going down the eminent domain path, it's lost value because, you know, because of that. You don't have the free use to do whatever you want with the property because everything around it's, right?
Okay, true. Okay, other thoughts on that?
I definitely see that providing a value above market value is an incentive. Instance, as you mentioned, instead of going through the threat of eminent domain, because for both parties, it's one
Which
very time consuming.
Right.
It's very time consuming. Going through the judicial procedure of it. It's very timely, energy intensive. So both parties would not like to go through that.
Right. And so usually, in a lot of these cases, they never really get brought to court, and many of them, you know, it's just simply, they offer you the money, you take the money, you run away. But what if, I mean, does it change anything in your mind, you know, and as opposed to the scenario that I just painted versus the more emotional one of saying that this particular parcel is maybe somebody's homestead that's been in their family for the past 150 years. They've all lived there. It's currently occupied by them, you know, with their family, and has been, you know, for the past 150 years. but, maybe it's a farm with, once again, kind of a farmhouse kind of, sort of thing. And once again, local government says, we need this because we need to put in a new rail line, or we need to put in a new, power line distribution system, or we need to put a oil pipeline through that property, or we need to potentially build a school there, or whatever the case may be. So what do you think about that under those circumstances? Does that change your perspective at all, or do you, still kind of hold firm that it's the best thing to do for kind of the government's perspective and the people's perspective?
It's actually a very specific example you just mentioned with there's a case, court case going on in Texas right now between property owners and Texas Central Railroad, where they want to do a site survey on farmers' property. Yep. But property owner is not allowing that because A, it's his property, he doesn't want any development on it. And so so the TCRR sue so they can gain access to the property because it's for a public good. Right. But the problem is, the property owners are suing TCRR in the sense that where's your railroad? You don't even have a rail going through there. It's just a concept at the moment. And so now they're fighting for that purpose. That's not. So in that sense, they cannot go through the eminent domain process because they don't have that tangible good.
Okay. All right. Nope.
It doesn't change anything.
Okay.
Just because somebody has sentimental value to the property and somebody else let the property deteriorate or live there for 100 years, it doesn't change anything.
I know, but they're living on the
What-
property. That
Yeah.
doesn't change anything for you?
It doesn't change anything.
The other one's dilapidated, nobody's using it. There's a whole family here.
It doesn't change anything. The root of the cause for the eminent domain is the same. It's for the public good. Now, I understand that there's more value to one person because they live there, but it still serves the same purpose. So, not to say that I would want my property to get
Of course not.
eminent domain on, but there is a time and a place.
Yeah, because it could very well be that this property just happens to be, for its own, kind of circumstances, right in the path of where the growth corridor is going to be and where we need to put that new road, where we need to put that new, facility, and we don't have a lot of choice.
They had a program on TV the other day in Seattle, the movie Up, right, the cartoon movie where they kind of moved their house. Yeah. It's based on a little tiny house in Seattle that it's the smallest house, and the lady wouldn't sell, and they basically ended up building a whole shopping center around her house.
Yeah, and it's a lot more common than you actually think. There are local instances across the country of where, those sort of, circumstances occur that maybe they weren't able to get eminent domain because maybe they weren't a public entity, that they were a private sector developer. And so the, sort of the next point of this would be, okay, so what if I, as a private sector developer, say, hey, I want this to build a new shopping center, okay, or some other more private sector kind of enterprise, a new hotel, let's say, okay, and the circumstances are, once again, deteriorated property, hasn't been, really put to any productive use, and maybe, it's only generating currently in its current state, maybe $10,000 a year in property taxes for the local government. But if I buy it, I build my hotel, it might generate, let's say, $10 million a year of property taxes, okay? What do you think about that? Do you think that, once again, the local government should step in and say, hey, this is for the public benefit. We're going to generate now, $10 million of property taxes versus only $10,000 because this property was in disrepair for so long. So you think it's a legitimate use of eminent domain?
No.
That's a slippery slope right there.
Yeah, that's a
But
way
you
slippery slope.
can argue, though, it is for the public good in the sense that's $10 million of tax revenue that the existing residents of that community will not necessarily have to come up with.
Yeah, but it's a
But I
private
think it would set a
developer, right?
precedence for
Yeah.
future eminent domain, and I don't think a court would
Yeah, you don't want to go there with that.
Yeah.
Anybody else perspective on that?
It depends on how you go about doing it.
Okay, give me an example or a perspective.
We can offer the residents,
What's,
like a buyout.
okay, but let's say we've already done that. We've offered them buyout, they refuse.
Oh.
Is this not recording?
I don't feel like it's a good use, of eminent domain, but I think it happens.
Absolutely it happens. It's how the Dallas Cowboys Stadium got built in Arlington, Texas a few years ago. Specifically, it was the use of eminent domain that acquired a lot of the land from private sector owners that had no desire to sell whatsoever. Okay, and they basically got the city of Arlington to help them out with this process, because the city of Arlington saying, hey, we can generate big dollars in property taxes and in sales taxes if we build this football stadium, and potentially also acquire a bunch of land surrounding the football stadium for commercial development. Okay, now, almost immediately thereafter, the Texas State Legislature then put a moratorium where that wouldn't happen again. Okay, but they got to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. Okay, so it's interesting because, you know, the use of eminent domain for the acquisition of property for economic development purposes is something that has been discussed and utilized for many years. I mean, well, what if it's, I mean, you know, once again, how do you define a public use? Like, for example, what if it's low-income housing that they're wanting to put there? Okay? I mean, you know, and, once again, you've got a derelict, you know, building that has not been generating any income whatsoever, you know, for the local government other than this paltry $10,000 a year in property taxes, and then you've got a developer coming in and saying, hey, we're going to solve your low-income housing crisis within your community by building a massive project on this site. It's going to generate some property tax revenue and some other things for the community, maybe not $10 million a year, but it's going to, you know, it's going to provide, you know, more property tax revenue, and it's going to help solve your crisis, if you will, with the lack of affordable housing. So is that enough of a public use for you? Because, I mean, once again, to a certain extent, you know, the way you have to kind of see this is, you know, it's a continuum. You know, you've got, without question, you know, the private use that you would put the property to after acquiring it versus, you know, the public use. You know, the public use, you know, on this end of the spectrum, these are the things like, you know, the roads, you know, the utilities and other sort of infrastructure, you know, public schools and that sort of thing. And then over here, you know, the private uses, you know, would be things like, once again, stadiums or potentially hotels or entertainment complexes, that sort of thing. But then, you know, somewhere in the middle, you know, do you have these other uses that maybe, you know, kind of are a bit more hybrid in nature, like parking garages, okay? But once again, the revenue from the parking garage is going to go to a private sector developer, but the community is going to benefit from having that parking garage for much needed parking for all of the facilities that are within their community. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So my point with this is, I'm not, you know, coming to you with an absolute answer on this, but this is one of those sorts of things that from, you know, a local government perspective, this is something that's faced constantly, you know, by local governments and real estate developers in trying to determine what direction that maybe they want to go with their communities. Because there are certain communities that have kind of, you know, by virtue of their political persuasions, have said, we, you know, are only going to ever consider using eminent domain when it is an absolute clear-cut case that this will be used for a public use. Whereas there are other communities, especially if they happen to have a fair number of real estate, you know, and kind of economic development professionals sitting on their local council, that may say pretty much anything goes. We find a project that will generate revenue and we are going to at least conceptually back the idea of using eminent domain for that purpose. Now, once again, from the litigation perspective, then that gets into state by state sort of regulation that may preclude that, you know, because certain state legislatures have expressly prohibited eminent domain from being used for sort of purely economic development reasons, and then other states have said, yeah, it's okay.
No, I mean, you know, property rights are like what, you know, part of the Bill of Rights, right? Like the right to own property, and the eminent domain is taking property, you know, by force. I don't know what Florida's laws on it are, but, I mean, you know, you're making the case of trying to push it more towards like the private equilibrium.
I'm not trying to
point.
push it in either direction, I'm simply putting it out there from a point of discussion.
Needs to be like a clear-cut public, you know, major road, major expansion, like not some hotel that's gonna generate tax money.
I have a question. Can a private developer use the government to get a piece of property?
Absolutely,
They did it in Dallas.
absolutely happens all the time.
Okay.
That I have an idea that I want to build something of significance for the city. I go to the local government and say, hey, there is this parcel of land. It's been sitting vacant, dormant, you know, whatever, for a number of years. The owner of the property refuses to sell it. I'm trying to help you build up your community in terms of your property tax base. Help me out. And then local government goes through all their public hearing process and you know, brings this out into the open to the extent that they have to. And then at some point, what may happen is the local government buys this property, actually, for the developer.
Got it.
And then we'll do what's called a land write-down, which means maybe they buy it for $1 million, and then they turn it over to the developer for $1. Okay? And the idea there is that the developer, by virtue of their cost basis in the property only being $1, they can probably do a lot more with that property than they would be able to otherwise. But the local government can do that in the name of, once again, economic development.
Yeah, but it's really the government that's driving the car, let's say, but they have a back end perspective.
Well, it's a public-private partnership,
Okay.
or P3 as what ones are called, okay? And, you know, they should be very open, very direct about what's going on. And, you know, a lot of times what will take place is that the local government is, by state law, is forced to come up with a comprehensive plan, okay? And then within that comprehensive plan, there is attention given to maybe specific areas throughout the community that are ripe for redevelopment. And then we'll hold public hearings to that effect, you know, over the, regarding the entire comprehensive plan, and we'll publicly put out there, we have identified this particular area as an area that is blighted, that is not contributing to the local economy. Therefore, we as a local government are going to pursue initiatives that are potentially going to place this property into the hands of a private sector developer to move forward with a project that's going to add tax dollars and jobs and sales tax revenues and that sort of thing to the community. Does that make sense? Okay. Thoughts, comments, observations? Okay. Does that scare you? Does that make you happy? Does that make you sad? I mean, how do you feel about this?
I have a question.
Okay?
So if they wanted to impose an eminent domain claim on a structure that was federally insured, such as a bank, how would that go about?
That wouldn't matter.
Wouldn't matter?
Shouldn't matter. I mean, not unless I'm missing something.
No, it's just.
I mean, now it couldn't be a
Because
federal,
if
no,
you
no,
just-
no, okay, okay, you said federally insured,
Right,
not federal property.
correct.
Okay, like in other words, a local government cannot use eminent domain to take ownership of a state property or a federal property. They're gonna be trumped, obviously, by, you know, each of those, okay? So, you know, there is kind of a hierarchy, if you will, that at the bottom end of the spectrum, you know, it's probably utility companies being able to use limited powers of eminent domain, followed by the local government, followed by the state government, followed by the federal government, and then also somewhere in that mix are like railroads and a handful of other, you know, folks.
I was just thinking with this, if you tried to move Chase Plaza, right, that would displace X amount of jobs, it would be devastating, right? But then if Bank of America swept in and said, you know, we're gonna create $20 million of taxes, how, you know?
No, I mean, it's gonna be, at the end of the day, it's a cost-benefit analysis, to a certain extent, you know, and that's the way that the local government potentially could look at it and just simply say, it is a cost-benefit analysis, and to what extent, which path is going to lead us to greater prosperity within our local community based upon the action that we take with eminent domain for this property. Does that make sense?
Sounds great.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how, in many cases, it's pursued and used, okay? All right, let's move on. All right, so that's eminent domain. Okay, the next one is tax increment financing. Not a single person put their hand up or initialed out here that they had a clue what tax increment financing is. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So what if we've got a city and then within that city in the middle we've got our core or central business district, all right? And that central business district has maybe, once again, become blighted, become deteriorated in some way, and we're trying as a local government to figure out, is there some way that we can potentially re-energize this central business district? And part of the reason why it's kind of fallen into disrepair, part of the reason, is maybe some of the physical, visible infrastructure. For example, maybe the streets in the downtown area really haven't been redone in a number of years. Maybe the street lighting needs to be redone. Maybe the sidewalks need to be redone. Maybe we need to add an additional parking garage in the downtown area to make it more accessible to people because there's not adequate parking. Maybe the downtown area has a perception that it's unsafe after dark. So we need to provide maybe officers on the street walking the streets at night to potentially make local folks feel good about it. Maybe there's no one living in downtown, so maybe we need to think about bringing people into residences within the downtown area. Okay, so you get the general idea. So we've got this downtown area that is not all that attractive at the moment. And if a developer were to come in without sort of any local government involvement, what would they have to do? Well, they would have to buy a property, within that area, potentially tear down what's there, rebuild it, whatever it is, because maybe part of the reason why that's also deteriorated is maybe some of those properties that are within the central business district, maybe they've got environmental problems. Maybe they're laden with all sorts of asbestos contamination, or lead-based paint, or maybe they've got underground storage tanks that have leaked into the water system. There could be a whole number of things that could be problematic about those properties, and maybe the developer doesn't want to take that chance of buying that property, tearing it down, getting a quote-unquote clean site that they can build on. Or they view the existing building that's on that site just too complicated because of all of the issues of worrying about, well, there's all this environmental sort of stuff that they're going to potentially be faced with that it would potentially drive the cost of renovation, through the roof. So, what can then the local government do to potentially make that particular site or that particular location more attractive financially for the developer? Well, that's where local government can step in and say, we're going to create what is referred to as a tax increment financing zone, okay? And what this typically does is it will sort of designate maybe an entire area of the city, in this case, maybe the central business district, and say, this area deserves our attention, okay? And so what is going to happen is the moment they choose to do that, let's say, November the 5th, 2016, they've chosen to create this tax increment financing zone. What happens on that date? Well, immediately they freeze all values within that area, property tax values, okay? Now what that means is that right now we take a snapshot of what the values are for tax purposes, property tax purposes, of every single property within that boundary. Okay, does everybody understand that?
Are we talking in the CBD or outside of the CBD?
In the area that we have designated the TIF district, okay, which in this case happens to be the entire CBD, okay? Now, they freeze the property tax values, and let's just say, for our purposes, the total property tax values for that area are maybe $100 million, okay, are the current value of all the properties within that area. Now, what happens at this point is the local government will then say, by incentivizing, or how can we go about incentivizing the developer to come in and redevelop this? Well, what they will do is they will say, what are some of the things that we can do to make this area maybe more visually attractive? All right, we as a local government will come in, we will replace all of the infrastructure within this area. We'll come in and we'll put in new streetscapes, put in, new lighting, we'll put in, new planter boxes, we'll potentially acquire property within this area, tear down the buildings, and get the sites cleaned up, and then after they've done all of that, we'll effectively say to the developer, okay, here we've bought a property or we bought local properties within this area, we've torn them down, we've cleaned up the sites, now you can come in and build your brand new hotel. Okay, what's the catch? Well, the catch is that the local government now has the ability to, in essence, capture all of the tax increment above and beyond what the base value was to be able to pay for those improvements, okay? And you're saying, well, wait a second, don't they already get the tax value? Well, okay. What this allows them to do, usually by state law, is that they not only get to capture their property tax value, they also get to capture the school district's property taxes, the county's property tax, in addition to the local city tax, and then other taxing jurisdictions that may be within that area. You're saying, well, how can they do that? Well, once again, it's all in the name of economic development, and the state gives them the right to do this. And the reason the state gives them the right to do this is it's what's called it's called the but-for argument. In other words, had it not been, or, if we had not done this, if the government had not intervened in this local sort of situation, this new development would not occur, okay? In other words, if we had left everything alone, this new redevelopment would have not taken place. And so, but for the local government taking this action, now we are potentially creating value, okay? And so the idea is the state gives the local government the opportunity to basically say, we're going to be able to capture all of the property tax receipts that are above and beyond that $100 million valuation. So all of a sudden, let's say that the expectation is, by virtue of the city making all of these investments within the zone, they're able to potentially get the overall value bumped up from 100 million maybe to $1 billion, 10 times that, okay? What happens is that the local government would then get their proportion of their property taxes above and beyond this, along with the school, the county, and the city. You're saying, well, wait a second, how much revenue are we talking about here? And how long would they get it? Well, typically, They would get it for a period maybe up to 30 years. In many cases, they'll shorten it down to maybe 10 to 15 years, but what they're actually getting here is that combined overall tax rate for the school, the county, and the city. Well, depending on where you live across the country, every local jurisdiction has a different tax rate. In a lot of states, it is not uncommon for the combination of those three to approach 3% of value is being taxed each year of the total value. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, so if we have $1 billion, okay, 3% of $1 billion is what?
Not a lot of money.
303.
I mean, sorry,
3 million bucks.
30 million.
30.
Okay, $30 million a year. Now keep in mind, the original up here, if we had $100 million in property taxes at 3%, what is that going to be?
3 million.
3 million. Okay, so instead of generating $3 million a year in property taxes, we're now going to be generating $30 million a year in property taxes, or a difference, or an increment of 27 million. So what we're able to do with that extra $27 million of property taxes that we're generating is we can buy bonds or issue bonds on behalf of the local government, on behalf specifically of the tax increment financing zone, and then use that bonded capacity to pay for all of these public improvements that we want to put into this district. But if we spend all this money making this area more attractive and no one comes to develop in it, we're screwed as a local government, okay? Because we're not going to get that increase in the property tax revenue. Does that make sense? So the whole idea behind this is up front, chances are you're going to want to partner with at least one developer, if not multiple developers, to ensure that there are multiple projects lined up that's going to help you accomplish that increase in property tax value. Now, the thing about it is, this is not giving a developer a break, okay, in this particular instance. You're not saying to the developer, we're going to give you lower property taxes if you come in and build. No, no. We're saying you come in and build, but all we're doing or attempting to do is we as a local government are trying to put this particular area of town on an equal playing field or better playing field than other areas of the community, to give it, in one sense, preferential treatment. Does that make sense? Okay? So let's open this up for question discussion. Noah?
I was gonna ask, what happened with Sistrunk? And I heard a lot of people left. I wasn't sure if you knew what was going on there.
I don't know. Erica?
They get this 27 million increment for the whole time that that is.
However long it takes to basically pay off the debt they have incurred on that site.
Okay.
And so the way that this would work, in relatively simple terms, it would be like putting this into your financial calculator and saying, okay, we're gonna have to make yearly payments, so one payment per year, and you're gonna put in $27 million as the payment that the local government can afford. And then you would say, all right, we're going to do these payments for maybe 10 years. And the interest rate that we're going to have to pay the bondholders is maybe 1 or 2%. So maybe 1.5% is our interest rate on this. So how much can we actually borrow?
250 million.
I'm going to trust you on that.
248, 998.
Okay,
Just
all right.
rounded it up.
So
40
248.
million, 998, 982, and 90 cents.
Okay, good enough. All right, so what that means is that with that $27 million a year of new revenue that the local government is generating, they would be able to go into debt for 10 years at 1.5% interest, $248 million. So up front, when they issue those bonds, they would be able to issue almost $250 million worth of bonds to be able to go into that district and do all the wonderful things that they feel like they need to do to ensure that area is going to be prime for redevelopment. You know, and as I said, you know, those activities could be buying up individual properties within that district, tearing down the buildings, cleaning up the sites, so that you just got the raw land to, you know, to start with as a developer, and you don't have to go through all the headaches and the brain damage of tearing down a building that might have asbestos, or tearing down a building that might have lead-based paint, or tearing down a building that might have other, you know, sort of issues that you're going to have to potentially deal with. You're removing that from the process. But it could also just simply be that you are doing all of this, and then, as I said, you're providing beautiful streetscaping and infrastructure in the area to you know, make the area more visually appealing for a developer to want to come into that area. Does that make sense? I mean, have you not ever been to locations and cities where you're sort of puzzled that maybe a lot of, you know, actual redevelopment maybe has not yet taken place, but all of a sudden you're looking around, wow, they've got beautiful streets, they've got all these redone sidewalks, all these, you know, great lights and everything, and then you're struggling. Well, why is all that here, but yet no development is here yet? Well, that's part of the reason, is that they bonded up and effectively done all these sort of improvements to try to encourage people to, you know, come into that area to redevelop. Okay, makes sense? Other questions? Yep.
I'm sorry, to whom are they issuing the bonds?
Just to anyone that will buy them. I mean, in other words, usually it's going to be institutional investors or retirees or anyone that will, in essence, purchase the bonds.
They wanna purchase the bonds.
In other words, you could buy tax exempt financing bonds. And what would happen in your case, you bought $100,000 worth of those bonds, you would get paid 1.5% for the next 10 years.
Okay, and but what happens, like, I bought the bond, okay, I'm good, I'm getting paid.
Well, no, you're the one that's providing the upfront money
It's
for
your
the local government to be able to then,
upgrade.
to do whatever has to be done.
Okay.
Yeah, they're issuing $250 million worth of bonds.
So you get a return
Right.
of 1.5% cumulative at the end of the year.
Okay.
And they're gonna pay for those bonds with that extra tax money they're gonna make.
Correct.
Does that make the actual property tax go up as a percentage number?
Well, the property tax value is going up tenfold.
Right.
Okay, and as far as the property tax rate, that may stay unchanged. It could change, but for the most part, it may stay unchanged.
No, the reason why I ask, because I've seen a developer do that in a community, a gated community, where they pass on the bond payments onto the homeowners.
Yes,
That's the same thing?
yep,
Okay.
well, very similar concept.
Well, so what it is with the school county city is that you're freezing basically the cost for the services, right?
To a certain extent, but you're also, the idea is also that every dollar of newfound tax revenue that is being generated here, this $27 million, that instead, and this is a point that I left out, instead of that money potentially being able to be spent throughout the community as a whole, you're saying we're keeping every stinking dollar that area creates within that area. In other words, we're not going to be supporting, you know, some new road construction out here. All the money that's generated by this district is staying in that district. Okay, make sense?
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Okay. Other thoughts? Okay. All right.
Where did you get the billion versus the 100 million? Is that just
made up numbers?
Yeah, so in other words, the 100 million is what everything is worth today, November the 5th, 2016. The billion is saying
Forecast.
we expect within the next 3 to 5 years there to be or close to $1 billion of new development that's gonna take place here, whether it's hotels,
So then
restaurants.
The underwriter of the bond would go through that, correct?
Yes,
Okay. That's just-
absolutely. To see that you have a legitimate, sort of plan put in front of you.
Right.
Now, so in some cases, with really small local governments, this can be done on a very small scale, where that district, may only be, a few $100,000. And they're just trying to generate some extra money to once again, put in potted plants and some, new, street lights or whatever it might be. But usually the idea is that it is to redevelop a blighted area that sort of has been neglected in some way, and that you are able to target and focus all the revenue that's created from that area to stay in that area and not be used for other things.
And then the hope is that 10 years down the line or whatever, that. it
Hopefully
actually-
sooner.
Or, okay, that it generates that instead of
Yeah,
27.
you don't want to spend all of this money, inherently up front, unless, once again, you've got a developer that's already there, they're already committed, they're already, moving forward with something. You don't want to, obviously, just build out the infrastructure and they will come, you don't want to take that risk. Now, some communities have done that, where they may have gotten it partially sort of committed, but then, a significant part of it falls through, and then the local government is inherently left on the hook for those bonds that it issued.
Two questions. So can they take the 10-year bond that are short-term bonds with that money that they receive from the 10
They
years?
could. I mean, I don't want to complicate it up, but yeah, theoretically, yes.
Okay. And the other question is, just say there's two roads on a smaller scale, pretty much in this district, right? Can they impose an eminent domain to direct traffic through one direction to bring funds into that, or force more traffic through that central business district? Or do you think that'd be a stretch?
Well, they could potentially put up a toll road at one and not at the other, indirectly causing that.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Okay. I mean, that's once again, that's what this whole idea of the government intervention thing is all about, is what are the different mechanisms does a local government have at their disposal, potentially, to kind of move things in a direction that maybe they want to see it moved.
So since you mentioned the toll roads, in terms of infrastructure, when they did this whole thing with SunPass and replaced all these jobs, displaced these people, I guess that would be a state of Florida thing, but it was only in Miami, or how does that work? Because it was FDOT, right?
Then more likely to be, a statewide thing.
So do they then lay those people off, or do they place them? I can't imagine they place them.
That's a whole other issue, and that's their choice. That's how they deal with that. Okay. All right, moving forward, development impact fees. This one I think is probably the most fun of all of these, okay? So this is where we take a city, and one city that did this in Texas was San Antonio. And it was kind of fascinating. They broke their city into different segments, and it was going to kind of make it a nice big sort of tic-tac-toe sort of square. And so we'll say we've got these different, this is a map of the city, let's say. Okay, so we've got 9 different districts within our city, okay? And, we've potentially got a big, sort of ring around the city in terms of road systems, running hither and yonder throughout the city. All right, now, what might a city choose to do in terms of making one particular area more attractive or less attractive to a developer? Well, they can charge development impact fees, okay? Development impact fees, by their very nature, are supposed to be fees to charge for the recovery of infrastructure that is needed for a new development. So for example, if we build a new housing development, what does the city have to potentially do? They may, depending on, once again, the local government, they may be responsible for coming in and putting in the roads, They may be responsible for coming in and putting in the water and sewer lines. They may be responsible for, building a new fire station or a new police station or a new city hall or whatever is necessary for this new area of town. Yes? Okay? That costs money. Okay? Who's going to pay for it? Well, if we were to say that all of that would be, occurring down here in area G, okay, that is currently not served with roads, not served with water and sewer capacity, not currently served with police and fire protection, because it's just one big open green space, okay, has not yet been developed, okay? But yet, because it has not yet been developed, that makes it very attractive for a developer to want to come in and say, hey, we want to develop this, because they can sort of start with a fresh, clean palette to come in and do maybe a large mass scale development. Make sense? Okay, but the local government is sitting back and they're saying, not so much, we don't like that, because that's going to cost us a lot of money to potentially, do that. And so what we're going to do is that for every home that you build, maybe within that particular area, we're going to charge a $50,000 per lot development impact fee. Okay? Well, what does that do? All of a sudden, that tells the developer, what? The city really doesn't want us building anything there. Or, if we build something there, we've got to build something really expensive in order to justify that $50,000 development impact fee. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? Whereas, on the flip side of this, you may have an area like Area E that is the central core of the city, kind of like what we were previously describing, that is already fully developed. And there, we're going to give you effectively $10,000 a lot as a rebate if you develop there. Okay? You follow? So all of a sudden, just on those two scenarios, what's going to be the most, theoretically, the most advantageous place for us to develop as a developer? Right here, because we're going to get a rebate of $10,000 per lot to develop there versus going down here and paying $50,000. Does that make sense? And then you're saying, well, why would the city do that? Well, once again, here, they've already got the water and sewer capacity that they need. They've already got the roads in. They've already built the police stations. They've already built the fire stations. All of that stuff is there. They don't have to build more of it. And so the point being is, down here, who's going to pay for it? Because see, this is one of the things. The city has, to a certain extent, the ability to say, we're not going to pay for any of this. You, as the new developer, have to pay for all of this up front. And so in some local governments, they say, we as the local government are not going to put in the water lines, we're not going to put in the sewer lines, we're not going to put in the roads. You have to build all of that out on the site fully and completely, and then whenever you are done with it, then you will effectively give it to us as local government, and ultimately, then we will now be responsible for it. Does that make sense? Okay? And that's quite a common practice, because and now granted, there are going to be very specific guidelines as to how that's done, so that, in other words, the roads have to be a certain width, they're going to have to be a certain thickness, they're going to have, once again, certain size water lines, certain size sewer lines, so it's not going to be the developer can, potentially put in a bunch of shabby infrastructure. It's going to be very much dictated what they have to put in. But the point being is, then if they do that, and the developer pays for all of it up front, then that pretty much, might erase the whole necessity of having to, the local government charge them the $50,000 per lot development impact fee. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Okay. It's the same thing.
Oh, sorry?
Same thing.
It's the same thing, but it's a question of when it is paid and who pays it.
You're gonna build it for me, and then give me an easement. Like it's an impact fee, but you're right. Impact fees get paid up front.
Right.
Where the other stuff will be financed and.
Right. You know it.
what I was gonna say is if it's deeded over, is it deeded fee simple where the government then picks up all costs associated? Or would it be deeded over in which the developer still has a proportionate?
No, usually it's just gonna be abandoned or not abandoned, but it's gonna be a mandatory dedication on the part of the developer to the local government, for this.
Cause I was going through different plats where some were stated as fee simple and some were not.
Right.
So that's what I was kind of.
Yeah, the form of ownership is not inherently the most mission critical piece of this. It's more of just what technically is taking place, which is just simply a conversion of it going from the developer has done this and built the roads and the water sewer lines, all those sorts of things, and has set aside land for schools and whatever else, and now is turning all of that over to the local government for them to be able to do with it as they please. Okay, but you can also have a situation, I think you had mentioned something about like a gated community, and see, in a lot of gated communities, one of the reasons that they can be gated is they still own the roads within the community. Therefore, they are not public roads, they are private roads. Therefore, they can gate it off from the general public, but they are also, as the homeowners association or the developer that owns that, are going to be responsible for the maintenance and the upkeep of those roads for as long as it remains a gated community. Okay, make sense? Yep.
So, I'm still trying to get this gist with the impact fee. Is that, so, the local government places that fee onto the developer? Correct?
Yes.
But what can the developer do to kind of?
You can pass it on to the ultimate,
residents.
yeah, pass it on to the ultimate home purchaser or whoever is purchasing, you know, the property. Okay?
Yeah.
Because the general idea is this. Let's say that I happen to live appropriately over in area F, okay? And as an occupant of, and a taxpayer in area F, I know that all this new development is potentially being proposed down here in area G. I'm very happy here in area F. I've been living in area F for the last, 20 years, and it's fully built out. We can't have any more development in area F. And so any new development that takes place, let's say down here in area G, in the absence of this development impact fee, what may happen is that the cost of the city providing infrastructure to that area would then just get absorbed by the remainder of the city, and I would then have to pay my proportional share of the infrastructure being provided down here to area G. You follow?
Yeah, I follow.
And so that's part of what motivates a lot of this, is because you have existing residents of a community saying, look, we bought into this community 20, 30 years ago, and all of our homes happen to be up here, but all the new development is going to be down here. We don't want to have to pay for anything that occurs down here in terms of new roads, new schools, new whatever, because quite frankly, we would be happy all of this remaining farmland. You see? Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense.
Okay. Thoughts from you guys? I mean, you think it's a good idea, bad idea for the city to approach development like that? I mean, well, what about, put it this way. I think, well, I would be upset. What if I'm one of the owners down here in area G? Because effectively what you've done, let's say that I'm the guy who owns a bunch of farmland down here in area G. All of a sudden, with the city imposing this, you've done what to my property? You've made it not really valuable for developers to want to come in and develop on, because you're basically saying you're going to charge them all these fees to develop down here, so my property is not worth nearly as much as it was the day before you instituted this development impact fee. That's not fair.
It's not, but I mean, there's an impact to your development, so, yeah. You know?
You don't want development around you.
No, I mean, you gotta tie in the water, you gotta tie in the sewer, is it the 50,000, is it 40, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, there's costs associated with that, so it's, I mean, it's part of any development. Question is how much.
But my point is, why should these people down here potentially be penalized and be forced to absorb all the cost of their development when the people up here, whenever the city was initially being developed, they shared and shared alike, so to speak, on the cost of the development taking place? You follow what I'm saying? It's kind of like, okay, these guys got in first, they're okay, you know, and they're going to get to control everything that occurs subsequent to them.
Yeah,
Can it just depend on just, I mean, demographic issues? I mean, it could be what, slow growth, and there's not as much demand.
My whole point with this is that literally, like within the city of San Antonio and other cities that have done this, that you could literally have a different incentive or disincentive in each of these areas of town based on different issues. That, like, for example, in one area, they don't want you to develop there because it's environmentally sensitive. Okay? Not because of the infrastructure capacity, but because it's environmentally sensitive. Okay? Maybe they don't want you to develop over here because once again, the cost of maybe providing water to that area is extremely prohibitive because you're going to have to drill through bedrock or something in order to get the water capacity delivered there. So the point is there's a variety of different competing reasons as to why the local government would potentially do something like this. My whole point to you as potential new developers is, number one, you need to be aware of this. Number two, understand why something like this exists and why the local government would put something like this into place, because at the end of the day, they're trying to minimize political conflict with these people up here and also ensure that this development pays for itself, that it's not putting an undue burden on the remainder of the city. Because especially if your developer, your city starts growing really, really fast, and you all of a sudden have to start putting in all these roads, all this sewer capacity, all these schools, all that stuff all up front, and you don't do a good job of planning that out, you potentially are stuck with this huge debt burden around your neck for years as a local government that is difficult in some cases to claw out from underneath, and you may have to do things that otherwise you would never do to deal with that. And I bring up the city of Arlington. One of the reasons why the city of Arlington has had to do many of the things it has done with being so aggressive toward getting new development to come into their community is that prior to the 1980s, they had such rapid growth, and they did not charge for a lot of these things, and they got saddled with one of the highest debt loads of any city in the country at the time. And so they learned their lesson really quick, and then also subsequent to that growth, then were one of the first to impose development impact fees to sort of deal with that problem so it wouldn't happen again in the future. And so many other cities have then followed suit whenever they have experienced exceedingly high levels of growth. Make sense? Okay? All right. Next one is pretty straightforward. Property tax abatements. Okay? This is just simply saying to a developer, and then it could be, in many cases, it could be for public housing, could be for maybe manufacturing, usually not going to be for office development or retail development. Most of the time it's going to be for, like I said, public housing or probably some sort of manufacturing kind of job creation sort of thing. But the local government will say, if you come in and you build your project within our community, we will give you a property tax abatement, meaning you will not, as the developer, have to pay property taxes for some sort of set period of time. And that might be 5 years, might be 10 years, usually not more than 10 years. And the idea behind that is that's going to reduce your operating cost as the developer of that property to maybe such a level that you would then be more likely to choose this community maybe over another to do your development because they're willing to give you this incentive. Does that make sense?
But it also gives incentives to residents as well, because you won't have to pay as high property taxes as well.
Well, it depends on what kind of project we're talking about, because in most instances, we're talking about like low-income housing that's rental housing and manufacturing facilities, and so it's not necessarily a property tax abatement. Usually it's not, I mean, there are exceptions, but usually it's not given to like individual homeowners.
The
developer.
Usually, yeah, just to the developer.
Yeah, because in my, what I'm talking specifically is about in New York City, where with the high property values and just most of the buildings there are multifamily, so then in that case, the property taxes that are provided are separated to each condo.
Right, and in those cases, usually then it's not necessarily a property tax abatement, it's that the property taxes are frozen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's a difference, because an abatement pretty much just says, we're forgiving you of any and all property taxes. Whereas having the property taxes frozen is saying, okay, as of this day and time, you know, the current property tax amount that you have to pay each year is $1,000, and so for the next 10 years, you're only still going to have to pay $1,000. Versus an abatement would be current, you know, taxable amount that you have to pay would be $1,000. It's going to be zero, and now it's going to be zero for the next however many years, regardless of what the value of the property is. Okay. All right. Now, once again, this brings up the whole thing that, well, somebody got something I didn't. All right. That, you know, whether we take this, you know, as an example or not, but you have, you know, one property owner here that manages to get that abatement, okay? And what about everybody else around them? You know, it's kind of like this person got a great deal, they're not having to pay property taxes for the next 10 years, but yet somebody else has a project that's similar to theirs right across the street, they didn't get a property tax abatement. So you could make the argument that, you know, these folks, you know, not only got an unfair deal, but they have a competitive advantage now in that they're able to charge lower rents on their property than the folks that didn't get the property tax abatement. Putting them in a more competitive position to where it might put out of business on the margin those folks that aren't getting the property tax abatements. Any thoughts on that?
How it works, man.
Yeah.
I mean,
So that's like,
it's kind of like when you're working for a company and you find out that that guy that just got here is like making like $50,000. You're like, man, I've been here longer than he has. Why am I not making that money, right? Or, I mean, where do you draw that line?
it's kind of like the widowers exemptions and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's, or now they have all these incentives. Why couldn't I take advantage of those when I had it? Well, it wasn't there. It wasn't up. You know, it wasn't up. I don't know.
It could also just be physical constraint. There's nowhere else that can be built on a property that's already exists there.
That's a possibility, but I mean, you know, for the most part, once again, these are predominantly given out to, you know, sort of encourage, you know, once again, new development to come in. And as I said, you know, early on with this whole discussion, virtually every single one of these devolves into, it's all about the money. It's a question, in this case, the local government is simply saying, you as the developer aren't going to have as high of operating expenses on an annual basis because you're not having to pay property taxes, so therefore that's going to make your ability to be successful here hopefully higher than potentially it would be otherwise. Okay, moving on. Government enforcement of deed restrictions, okay? Most of you have probably heard over the years that, you know, you talk about zoning and zoning restrictions and other, you know, forms of land use control. And one of the cities that consistently gets brought up as not having zoning is Houston, Texas, okay? And it's probably the largest city in the country that doesn't have zoning, and there's a reason, or there is a way that they still deal with land use regulation or government intervention in land use without having zoning. And that is the use or government enforcement of deed restrictions. What are deed restrictions? Basically, you as the developer have the ability, whenever you develop a property, whether it's a residential property or a commercial property, industrial property, does not matter. As the developer of that property, one of the beautiful features that sometimes goes unused that you have is you, as a developer, can create deed restrictions and say, this property can never be used for X, Y, or Z, okay? Or can never be developed beyond the boundaries of X, Y, or Z, or can never have density on this property beyond X, Y, or Z. Or, once again, never be used for a particular use, okay? And so what has happened in Houston specifically is Houston spends a lot of time and effort of keeping track of these deed restrictions that have been placed on properties, and then they, in many cases, in order to ensure that development is orderly and that development occurs in the way that they want it to occur, they intervene and they actually will take subsequent property owners to court to ensure that these deed restrictions are being met and are being enforced. And so the interesting thing is that even though the city itself doesn't actually have zoning saying, you know, and once again, you know, traditional zoning is where, okay, you know, we have sort of divided the city up into all of these, you know, different zones, and we're saying that once again, this is maybe a commercial zone, this is a residential zone, you know, this is maybe light industrial, you know, this is manufacturing, maybe this is multifamily residential, whatever it might be. We've broken the city up into all these different zones. Well, you know, with traditional zoning being dedicated or driven by what are the uses of those areas, that with deed restrictions, you can simply have an area within one of those zones based upon who the developer of that area was, setting what the restrictions of use are going to be for that property, and saying it can only be used for residential, or it can only be used for office, or whatever the case might be. And so it's kind of an interesting overlay of a local government getting involved in the enforcement of private sort of deed restrictions, or in some cases imposing their own deed restrictions by buying the property and then subsequently placing deed restrictions on it. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, okay? And that's one of the few places you actually see that. Okay, moving on. Mandatory dedications and exactions, and kind of the nexus that needs to be in place for that to occur. One of the things that we have kind of talked about here all along is this idea that local governments can extract something from you as the developer in order for you to be able to build whatever it is that you want to build on this particular property. And so the idea that you come in to a local government and you say, all right, I want to build this residential, you know, subdivision, but then the local government says, all right, if you want to build this residential subdivision, you know, once again, you've got to put in all the roads throughout this residential subdivision, but beyond maybe putting in the roads and the physical infrastructure that we're accustomed to, the local government may say, we want some mandatory dedications or exactions from you, and that might be, all right, we want you to set aside this particular area of land for a park. We want you to set aside this particular area of land for a school. We want you to set aside maybe this area of land for a new city hall, okay? And what, in essence, it's like a form of blackmail, because the local government is in essence saying, if you don't set aside these mandatory dedications, or specifically these exactions that we are extorting in essence from you, we will not let you build your development. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like this whole upfront kind of negotiation process that you have to engage in with the local government of, in essence, them telling you specifically what those exactions or dedications are going to be required to be. And then, as I said, as a result of that, then you're hopefully able to build what you want to build.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we went over that in the land use, and I believe it was a was it rational nexus?
Rational
Yep.
nexus.
And rough
And the
proportionality.
whole idea behind the rational nexus, or is it a connection? That in other words, it's connected to the site, it's connected, that there's a reason for being for those items to be extracted from you. That it's not some random sort of nonsense that you as local government are sort of saying, well, we want all of this stuff. There needs to be, a rational foundation for it, that by virtue of this new community sort of expanding, we need to have parkland to be consistent with other areas of our city. We need to have a school, an extra school to be consistent with other areas of our city. And then, a city council substation, and once again, to service that particular area of the city. Okay? All right. Other thoughts, questions on this? Okay. So what do you think about just the whole idea of kind of that negotiation process? I mean, were you aware that even existed? I mean, obviously from the land use
Yeah, with the
plan.
wetland mitigation, they basically, there was a case we went over where they were telling him, oh, you need to pay X amount of dollars into.
Yep, we'll talk about that. Yeah, the whole thing of basically creating wetland mitigation banks and then the whole deferral, but we'll get into that here in a little while. All right, so other questions or thoughts on the mandatory dedications or exaction stuff? Okay, all right. Now, the next one, control of use, height, bulk, density, aesthetics, and a handful of other things. This is kind of traditional sort of land use planning, land use controls that a local government puts into place. Why does the local government want to potentially control use? Let's just start with that one.
Public safety, right? Would be
Well, I
one
mean,
of
the
them.
normal ones are, yeah,
Planning,
health,
transportation.
safety, general welfare and morals, or the four biggies, if you look back at all the Euclidean zoning stuff, okay? But in terms of kind of really fundamentally what all this sort of boils down to, the reason they wanted to control use was to separate obnoxious uses from maybe not so obnoxious uses, okay? Obnoxious uses being, industrial plants that were maybe producing a lot of pollution or a lot of noise or horrible smells or whatever else it might be from the areas of town where people were living, and not wanting those two to be in close proximity to each other. Well, as things have kind of evolved over time, we've begun to be a bit more open-minded as it relates to this whole separation of uses. That for most local governments that have had their land use policies in place for 50, 60, 70, 80 or plus years, most of them are still using the traditional sort of Euclidean zoning, which is having a different use district for a different area of the local government or the local city, and saying you can only have that use or a set of permitted uses within that area, and won't allow for a mixture of uses. So there are a number of local governments where mixed use developments are simply not permitted by law because they have been designated as pretty much either a single use or a very narrow scope of uses, okay? And so this is something that is evolving and continuing to evolve, and in the past 15 to 20 years, you've had local governments that have become much more open-minded about the use aspect, and we have moved into what we sort of refer to as form-based codes, which in essence are saying we want an area of the city to look and feel a certain way. We really don't care what the specific use is, as long as it's not potentially obnoxious to another use. But we don't have a problem with having first floor retail, and then on top of that first floor retail having some office space, and on top of that maybe having a apartment community, and on top of that maybe even having a hotel. That's okay with us. We can, as long as we potentially are able to kind of build the structure in such a way that it accommodates each of those and it's not problematic, we're okay with that. But historically, this has been a really big problem. And if you go to a lot of smaller communities that are not overly sophisticated, that have the more traditional zoning, it's a real problem if you want to go in there and you want to build something that is a mixed use sort of property. Okay, make sense? Thoughts, comments about that? All right. Now, the height thing usually is just, I mean, obviously you think about, multiple cities throughout the US that, have skyscrapers built in them. But, what might be a reason why a local government would not inherently want to allow skyscrapers?
Well, this is like in the view of NIMBYs, and it's that because of create shadows.
Okay, yeah, so the whole not in my backyard argument of, yeah, I don't want a skyscraper, somebody living in that skyscraper looking down on me while, I'm in my backyard doing whatever I'm doing, or, whatever the issue might be. But, it's the kind of thing that, the height restrictions in many cases are going to put into place, obviously by the FAA to limit, issues with airplanes. But another reason why this, can be problematic is soil conditions in certain areas simply would not allow you to build potentially skyscrapers, or nor would they be appropriate, for a particular area, or, there may be other weather conditions that maybe precludes that, but, in terms of earthquakes, but yet again, we have exceptions to that. But the point being is that the local government typically can sort of set those sort of height restrictions and what is appropriate for that particular area. And the same thing whenever it comes to what are called bulk and density, which is just simply saying how much maybe of a lot can be covered. And what typically you will see is that you may have a parcel of land, whether it's residential or commercial, and there will be setback requirements potentially on all, 4 sides of the property, assuming it's a square or a rectangle, that may say, you cannot build any portion of your structure, within, these sort of setbacks. It could be as little as maybe 10 feet on each side, could be 20 feet, depending on what that particular area may dictate as to what's appropriate. And part of the reason for limiting, the site coverage is that, once again, to have access for the local government, maybe to provide utility service there, or, it could be once again, kind of a safety thing. It could also be that they want to have additional sort of access in the event that they have to widen the street. There's a whole number of reasons as to why they may require those sort of setback requirements, and then also may say, like I said, what that site coverage can actually be. All right, make sense? All right, moving forward. Probably one of the most controversial, aesthetics. How something looks. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder sort of thing, And so you have some local governments that have gone to an extreme of saying, we want a specific look or a specific feel, character within our community. We don't want housing or building products that don't conform to this particular design standard. Probably one of the most famous in the US is the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico. That pretty much, if you take a look at the city of Santa Fe, what do you see?
It's all clay structure.
Adobe.
Yeah, adobe sort of structures. And that is a requirement that the local government has placed there because they want that look, feel of the city to remain that. That's really part of their obviously their history, part of sort of the culture, and so that's a very important piece to them. Whereas, what we're accustomed to, maybe more locally in Florida or other parts of the country, is just make it down to the homeowners association level and saying you must have a roof of a particular type or a particular color. Or the housing stock within this area, here's a color palette of the specific colors that you can choose from to paint your home. And those sorts of, or your landscaping must be of a certain type. You cannot have this kind of grass, you must have this type of grass. All of that is once again driven by this, aesthetics aspect. Yep.
I was gonna say Nantucket, I know they have the whole roof, color, structure, is that homeowner? Is
Well,
that-
it can be both. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It can be both driven by a local homeowners association, or it could be driven by the local government, or in partnership with each other. And, but it's the sort of thing that, on the surface in a lot of places, you're just saying, I don't want the local government to be able to tell me what to do, but yet in the absence of that, you potentially, in a lot of people's eyes, you have chaos. If everybody's allowed to do everything they want to do with their property, you know, you can give example after example of, you know, things that have been built under those conditions, and then, you know, the resulting impact is sometimes monstrous.
Yeah, like somebody painting their house this color.
Yeah.
So how is that, wouldn't that somewhat impede on the right for free speech?
Well, it certainly impedes in the sense of that any additional regulation as a general rule can create value within a community because you're placing restrictions on what can and can't be done. Therefore, there's a consistency effect that will take hold. And then but it also, with that potentially added value, it also will more than likely drive up the cost of that development as well, because somebody has to enforce those regulations that have been put into place. And so that enforcement cost is also, you know, something that has to be considered whenever you know, add on those additional layers of the things that you can and can't do. Like, well, the simple one is homeowners association. Okay, all of a sudden, you know, you're living in a gated community, and your grass, you know, all of a sudden has gotten above whatever the requirement is. What do? They send out the local homeowners association, you know, representative to tell you cut your grass, or they maybe go to the extent of cutting it for you and then billing you for it. You know, and so the point is that, you know, this sort of stuff that, now with homeowners associations, it's fairly simple to kind of enforce this because you have pre-agreed prior to moving into that community to this long, you know, list of items that you must adhere to. And if you fail to adhere, you also have agreed to pay the penalties or suffer the consequences of what those may be. Okay, but if it's a situation of where it's kind of like an after the fact thing, you bought into the community, and now all of a sudden the local government is saying, we're going to impose all these brand new sort of architectural guidelines and aesthetic, you know, pieces, then, you know, you're going to have a tendency to say, well, maybe I don't agree with those, and I want to fight them, and there you may then become what's called a pre-existing non-conforming use, allowed to continue in operation for a period of time, but if you ever change anything about your property, then you have to come into conformance. So.
Okay, so does street wall, well, street walls also play into aesthetic wall in the sense of like how tall a certain ground floor has to be.
Oh, absolutely.
To encourage ground floor retail. So that of course limits in a way what developers can build on the site as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And see, part of all of this, and this is the you know, and I don't know, you know, to what extent that, you know, you guys have really had to deal with this both in the development class and in this course, but part of what you should have to do as an exercise at some point is take an existing, you know, sort of set of land use regulations for a particular site, and then from that, from the reading of that, then develop the building envelope. In other words, show what is the maximum square footage that can take place on this particular site. What is the maximum height? What are the individual floor heights that are required? What is the parking requirements? What are all these other things? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what you have to do in reality with, you know, these sorts of things. Now, granted, you can always petition for variances and petition for changes, but if you're taking it sort of as is, where is, then you're going to have to conform to those particular guidelines, so you need to become familiar with effectively what can you build, you know, on that side. Okay, moving on. Growth boundaries. All right, these are really big in the Pacific North, or Pacific Northeast or Northwest. I mean, like in Oregon, the state of Washington. In those areas, what has happened, like in areas around Portland, Oregon, Seattle, they have what are called urban growth boundaries. And they basically have said, we've got all this forest land, we've got all this, you know, beautiful, you know, pictorial sort of surroundings that, you know, we're in, and we've basically said, you know, here is our city located within this red circle, and all development that takes place needs to take place within this red circle. Any development that takes place out of there is either gonna be forbidden, or once again, we're gonna impose all sorts of restrictions and constraints on you that it makes it pretty much very prohibitive from actually developing anything of substance outside of this sort of urban growth boundary. Now, what they may or may not do is they may say, in order to have orderly growth, we will allow maybe an expansion of that urban growth boundary over periods of time to allow for growth to occur, but we don't want to have unbridled kind of leapfrog development growth. In other words, we want it to be controlled. We don't want to have a situation that instead of allowing the new development to occur here on the immediate periphery, we don't want to have what I would say is like leapfrog development, which is then maybe this area gets developed first, and then you've got this big gap there that is not developed. You want to potentially preclude that from happening and have very planned kind of controlled growth. These urban growth boundaries, they're put into place once again to kind of protect the integrity of the area and not allow maybe more pristine areas to be developed over time unless it's absolutely positively necessary. Yep.
Is it the same as the finger plan in Copenhagen?
Could be.
Because that's basically we have different corridors.
Yep.
It's basically Copenhagen. If you look on a map, it's basically land. It's right against the sea. Then it can only span basically north and west and a bit of south. So then basically you have these different corridors, basically along either highway or railroads, and each of that designates where higher densities can be utilized for
Gotcha.
Commercial, industrial, or residential. And the space in between basically just agricultural.
Yep. No, that's another form of it, but yeah. It's the same thing, because what you're sort of describing is kind of like an axial form of growth that you're basically saying that, let's say, we've got our urban core here, this is kind of how our city evolved over time, and then we've since put in different road systems over time, and then what we're going to do is we're going to allow development to occur potentially, along, each of those roads. It's kind of what was called an axial sort of form of development, but we don't inherently